Imagine waking up on damp straw, your breath fogging in the cold air of a thatched barn. Your right shoulder throbs. It always does. You stretch it out of habit, slowly, painfully, because you know you'll be drawing again before the sun is high. You've been wielding the war bow since you were a boy, and now you're nearly 30. That's old for an archer. Outside, England is quiet. Fields lie fallow, hedges are heavy with dew, and beyond the village green waits the earthen archery butt, weather-worn and silent. Today, like yesterday and the day before, you will string your yew-bow and practice to kill. This isn't a story about Agincourt or Poitiers. It's not about kings or glory. This is the life that came before the arrows flew. The body behind the bow, the pain behind the draw, and how an entire generation was shaped, bone, blood, and will, by a weapon made of wood. In medieval England, a boy did not choose the longbow. The longbow chose him. By royal statute, every male child was to begin training with the bow by the age of 7. It wasn't just encouraged, it was the law. Towns and villages designated butts, raised mounds at the edge of green spaces, where boys and men gathered after church to shoot. Playing dice or football instead of training could earn you a fine. Or worse. The early bows were manageable, but each year brought more weight. By their teens, boys were pulling 80 pounds. By manhood, over 120. Not once or twice, but dozens of times a day. The transformation wasn't metaphorical, it was skeletal. Modern examinations of archers' remains, like those pulled from the wreck of the Mary Rose, show a startling truth. Their right arms were swollen and thick, their spines twisted, their shoulders asymmetrical and permanently hunched. They weren't athletes, they were weapons. Drawing a warbow is not like flexing a gym machine. It takes your whole frame, legs braced, torso torqued, back bowed. It's a movement of violence, repeated with mechanical grace. A modern Olympic bow might draw 40 to 50 pounds. The medieval warbow? Often 120, sometimes more. And that weight wasn't held for a second. It was drawn and loosed rhythmically, 10 to 12 times a minute, and it had to be done while wet, cold, hungry, or wounded. Chronicler Jean Froissart once described English archers who drew with such force their arrows pierced the hardest mail. This wasn't exaggeration, it was physics. A bodkin-tipped shaft flying from a yew bow at 170 feet per second could split armor, crack ribs, and stop a horse. But building that kind of power required fuel, and archers didn't always get it. At home, their diet was coarse, barley bread, pottage, gruel made from grains, beans, and root vegetables, onions, garlic, ale. Meat was a luxury, sometimes salted pork or dried fish, but often it was gone. Drought, war, or plague could empty the larders. On campaign, rations worsened. Hardtack biscuits like iron, salted meat crawling with maggots, or nothing at all. Soldiers boiled leather to make broth. They roasted rats. They chewed on horses that had died in battle. An archer needed protein to recover, yet he rarely got enough. Muscle tore and never repaired. Ligaments frayed, bones fractured and healed crooked. Still, the next day, they would draw again. They had to, because to be English in that time was to shoot. Archery was no longer just training, it was identity. Kings made it so. Edward III, Henry V, Henry VIII, they all passed laws to enforce practice, to prevent foreign games from distracting the youth. You could be whipped for skipping practice. You could be fined for not owning a bow. Archery became national character, while the French fielded knights and crossbowmen and the Genoese charged gold for every bolt. England bred a class of fighters who needed nothing more than bent wood and iron tips. They were not nobles. They were yeomen, villagers, sons of shepherds. But when the arrows began to fall like rain, it was they who turned the tide. And yet, when the muster came, when the king called for war, they brought more than their skill. They brought their own gear, a bow, a sheaf of 24 arrows, a tunic, perhaps dyed red to hide blood, a belt knife, maybe a cattle helmet if they could afford it, no horses, no squires, just themselves. They were paid in pence, 2, maybe 3 per day, enough for bread, enough for ale, not enough for boots. Camps were cesspools. Men slept under wagons or in shared canvas tents. The sea spread like wind. Dysentery, lice, trench foot. There were no latrines, no physicians. The archer suffered silently, because he had to. When battle came, he stood behind the lines. A distance killer. First to strike, and, if the line broke, often first to die. Lightly armored and outnumbered, they were cut down quickly. If captured, they were not ransomed like knights. They were executed en masse. And still they loosed their arrows. Jean de Wavrin, describing the Battle of Formigny, wrote, "They loosed their last arrows as they bled." There was pride in that. A grim pride perhaps, but pride nonetheless. The damage wasn't always from the enemy. Drawing a warbow daily left bodies warped, dislocated shoulders, torn ligaments, fingers twisted into claws. There were no surgeons to fix them. Instead, folk remedies, superstition, and desperation. Poultices of garlic and honey. Comfrey, known as bone knit, mashed into aching joints. Boiled wine poured into open wounds. Leeches. Prayers to Saint Sebastian. Charms carved from bone. And when all else failed, amputation. And yet, they continued. They drew. They loosed. They limped. They endured. Most were done by 30, their joints worn out, their strength spent. They died in muddy fields, buried in pits, or they limped home and faded into the thatched shadows of forgotten villages. The longbow died with them, slowly, quietly. Guns emerged. Gunpowder could do what a man took decades to learn. A musket didn't care how strong your shoulder was. It didn't matter if you had trained since childhood. The bow became relic, then ritual, then memory. But traces remain, in shipwrecks, in graves, bones with curved spines and thickened arms, splintered bows buried beside them, hints of the pain they endured, hints of the wars they fought. You would not survive their life. Not because you are weak, but because they lived in a world built on necessity, pain, and submission to violence. They trained not to be warriors, but to be tools. They ate what they were given. They endured what they could not cure. They died for a king who would never learn their name. But for a time, for a strange, bloody chapter in history, the shape of war depended on men like them. And history bent briefly to the curve of the English bow.